Good afternoon and welcome to the first of ICEAA's 2023 Cost Challenge webinar presentations. I'm Megan Jones, ICEAA's Executive Director, and I'm really excited to be introducing you guys today to Team Quantech. They were the first grand prize winners of the first ever ICEAA Cost Challenge, and we're really excited to hear what they had to say when they answered the question, what is our total life cycle cost? I'm sure all of you are going to have lots of questions for the team. So if you would please put your questions into the chat, we'll be able to get to those at the very end. And if you have other technical questions or anything along the way, you can send those in the chat as well. Until then, taking lead today is going to be Patrick Casey from Quantech. He's going to introduce the team and they're going to get started. Go ahead and take it away, Patrick. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Megan. So I'll start off on camera and jump off when I get back in, get into the material here. But first off, just wanted to say thank you to everybody for attending and everybody who's interested in watching this on webinar. Big thank you to ICEAA for putting on this challenge. It was a great opportunity for all of us. And big thank you for putting on this webinar. I know we're very excited to see what other people did tackling this problem. And finally, a very big shout out to the judges. They spent a whole day not only listening to these presentations, but really engaging with the teams and even going so far as to provide feedback, which you'll see we've started to incorporate into our slide deck. So with that, I will go off camera and start sharing. So we are very proud to present our presentation, I See a Bright Future, Quantech's ICEAA Cost Challenge Response. This is our table of contents. We're going to start with some challenge background, our team composition, how we approached the problem, some of our planning and research. We're also going to cover our data background, how we approached the gathering and what we did when we gathered the data. We'll cover some of our analysis and results, finish with a wrap up, and that is the 4 sections of the slide deck that were presented to the judges as is. There is one small, tiny little tweak that we will call out, but the main portion of the slide deck has not been changed in any way. We did add some additional webinar content based on judges' questions and feedback. We really got a lot out of this and wanted to show that we were still thinking about it even after we presented. So Team Quantech consists of 4 mid-junior level cost analysts, myself, Patrick Casey. We have Gunnar Nichols.
Hello, my voice sounds like this.
We have Jennifer Aguirre.
Hello, everyone.
And Shannon Cardoza.
Hello.
So we all have various backgrounds supporting cost programs in the Air Force and Space Force. We all have various certifications and expertise, and we all have various degrees and come from different locations. So I think this made a really good team, really well-rounded, and we all learned something from this. Our team mentor is Alex Smith. He has over a decade of cost experience. He's a business area manager for Quantech. And because of that, he was very busy, but we still appreciate the support that he gave us when putting this together.
I'm irrelevant, Patrick, but thank you for the shout out.
Yes, sir.
All right, so we'll kind of kick off by going through the purpose and the scope of our estimate. So when this prompt was provided to us, as anybody who's heard the prompt or was involved in the prompt understands, it was left pretty vague, and that was intentional. So it was very crucial for our team to identify a common purpose and a scope to bound the information that we would collect and how we would analyze it. So the way that our team interpreted the purpose of this challenge was to provide the cost needed to sustain a human living in the United States over the entire duration of their life. So from the time they're born all the way until the time that they pass away. So our team decided to look at this from a program funding perspective, and we're calling this effort the Human Program. And so we have worked diligently to identify the cost needed to pay for the whole life cost of our human. So I will point out that we have found the Human Program to be an early requirements definition, and we did have a short deadline of approximately 1 month from start to finish. So that this did cause our estimate to be a ROM for budgeting planning purposes only. So we do understand that our team will continue to update and refine the estimate as requirements are better defined. So due to our Human Program being in the early requirements definition, we did have to make some overarching assumptions about our human and keep the scope of our costs that make up our WBS as high level as possible. That way we could get as much accurate data as possible without going too in the weeds due to that short timeline that we had. So we have ground ruled in and out various aspects of our human based on data availability given our time constraints, and have obtained various technical specifications for our human from our engineering expert ChatGPT. All right, so in order to create this estimate, our team worked collaboratively at every step of the way. We end up meeting on a weekly basis from the time our requirements were handed off from the program office, and ensure we reviewed each other's work and inputs along the way through the use of Google G Suite as our collaborative workspace. So this allowed us to see updates made by our teammates in real time. And since this was a collaborative effort, not one person had the final decision authority on any piece of the estimate. We ensured that we all agreed on every aspect, including the definition for the cost of a human, what the appropriate WBS elements were, appropriate data methodologies, such as using the most recent US averages, and appropriate risk ranges for each element. We made sure that we agreed on every step of the process as much as possible. And we then worked together to generate the various reports to include phase costs, tornado charts, and S-curves for our program management office.
Our initial ground rules and assumptions drove the specific data which we collected and established our understanding of the human we were aiming to represent in this whole life cost estimate. To represent the cost of a human in the United States, we focused on finding average US costs for the elements which composed our whole life cost model. Our WBS was broken out in phases: EMD, covering birth through college graduation at 22, production, covering the working years of our human from 23 to 67, and ONS, covering their retirement years and any disposal costs. In addition, we included two whole life categories, government costs and environmental costs, to represent the impact an average human has on these aspects of our society. Throughout our research process, ChatGPT was utilized as a replacement for the engineering expertise a cost estimator would often have access to, and helped us establish reasonable scope for the WBS and potential data sources for our cost elements. Next slide. Our data collection process was iterative and involved establishing a suitable data source for each element in our WBS. Throughout the estimation process, our WBS and best data sources were continually refined in our collaborative Excel file. When an ideal data source was established for a cost estimate element, the data point utilized to represent that element in our cost model was prepared in Excel and imported into ACEAA, where uncertainty and inflation were applied to establish our whole life cost model. For all of our data sources, we ensured the fidelity of the source, established the normalization techniques necessary to utilize, and confirmed the maturity of the data.
So here's a snapshot of some of our data sources. In far backup, we do have full citations and links for all of this information. So the first cost element on there is one you use most extensively. That is the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Reports. So that provides data on expenditures, income, demographic characteristics, and of consumers in the United States through two separate surveys, both an interview survey for major recurring items and a diary type survey for more minor or frequently purchased items. And we will be going into more information on that information, how we used it and normalized it in a few of the other slides.
So we did also try to account for costs that weren't included in our BLS consumer expenditure report, or were at least less clear on the costs for an individual person versus an entire household within that consumer expenditure report. So a couple of these costs included our child care costs, which we obtained from the World Population Review's child care costs by state, from which we use the US average as to not get a state bias cost, as well as public and education costs, which we obtain from the National Center for Education Statistics.
The United States Census was utilized as the source for the yearly population of the United States and was used to normalize federal and state spending costs per capita. The Congressional Budget Office was utilized as the source for federal year-end outlay values to establish the federal government cost per capita, while the National Association of State Budget Officers was utilized as a source for year-end state expenditure values, which established the state government costs per capita.
For average income, we went right back to BLS. They have an employment situation report where we got an average income. And to bound our estimate, we do have a life expectancy from the CDC's National Center for Health Statistics. So a little bit of information on our data normalization techniques. As mentioned, BLS was used most extensively, so we had to perform 2 separate normalizations on said data. First thing we did was we collected 5 years of data and decided on a 3-year average to account for any year-to-year variances in that data. Next, we had to perform a unique normalization based on how BLS performs its surveys. So when it receives survey responses, the averages expenditures are for a consumer unit. So in the report, a consumer unit is considered 2.5 people. And this, due to the fact that it is a survey, has different distributions for gender, housing, education, etc., based on the survey results. So in certain cases, we used a full 2.5 consumer units worth of cost. And in other cases, we thought it more pertinent to apply a one person, a 2.5 of a consumer unit's worth of cost.
To establish our government funding per capita numbers, the total federal spending in each of the years 2019 to 2021 were divided by the total number of US citizens in those years and averaged to establish the cost a human contributes to the federal spending. Similarly, the sum of the total spending for each of the 50 states in the years 2019 to 2021 were divided by the total number of US citizens and averaged to establish the cost of a human contributes to the state spending.
All right, one of the last normalization techniques that we'd like to highlight is the use of our US average CPI inflation rates. So we pulled the Bureau of Labor Statistics average CPI, not seasonally adjusted, for FY13 through 23 to ensure that we captured the entire fiscal year range for our input variables. So specifically that BLS consumer expenditure data, we got all the way back from FY13. So we wanted to make sure we started pulling inflation from that year on. And this allowed us to apply custom inflation percentages for each fiscal year that we had inputs for, as opposed to applying a just blanket percentage across the board. So we were asked to present our results in base year 23. So we did not try to forecast out any inflation rates beyond the FY23 values. I will also note that these inflation rates were only applied to our non-government expenditures, and government inflation was calculated separately and applied to our government specific costs.
These are the tenets that we use to analyze and evaluate our data sources. A big piece for us was reliability. So we pretty heavily tried to utilize official government sources like that BLS data. Most of the sources that you'll see in like our source slide are from .gov or .edu sites. And with this data, we know that's not always going to be completely up to date. So we did try and pull the most recent data that we had available. And I think for a lot of this, it was usually like the 2020, 2021 timeframe. So a couple years back, but about as recent as we can hope for from government sources. And then another kind of key piece here that Jen already kind of mentioned was the completeness side. We really wanted to make sure that we were capturing all the costs. And so if there were things that we saw that were missing from our BLS data, we did try and supplement with other sources. For example, those college tuition costs that we noticed weren't really being captured there as well. Next slide. And then once we analyzed our data sources and collected all of our data, we were able to build our model. Here's kind of a snapshot of that model for what the whole life cost of a human is in our estimate, broken out into the 3 major phases of life in the WBS. So RDT&E or EMD during childhood, production during working adulthood years, and then O&M in retirement. Within those phases, we also kind of created some sub-phases where more noticeable changes in costs sort of naturally occurred, like infancy versus teenage years in the EMD phase. You can kind of see age 0 to 2, 3 to 8, that sort of thing. And then what you see in each of those boxes is the yearly costs for each of those sub-phases rather than like the total cost. Just because we as humans kind of tend to comprehend, okay, what are we spending on annually for these things? And then note that we also have the government and environmental costs broken out here in the phases just to show what those were as well. When considering our risk, we wanted to perform uncertainty analysis line by line rather than at kind of like the total estimate level and just wrapping like one factor, because we knew there were some areas that there would be a little bit more uncertainty than others. One example would be like salary, since even if we assume average education levels. Income can really range depending on what career field you choose. So that one, we kind of try to do it line by line, even with the limited time that we had. And then now once the model has been established, it's kind of important for us to ask, the next step of, do the results make sense? Like just looking at this visually, does this kind of track to what we'd expect? And we thought it did. It makes sense that there would be some initial upfront investment in the early stages of life due to increased care intensity. So you can kind of see that in those earlier years, which then will taper off in the transition to adulthood and becomes actually negative as our human is able to provide services, aka work, until retirement, at which point those costs again until the end of life.
So that is a great segue into some of our ground rules and assumptions. And one of the big one you can see here is we are assuming that this human will be, quote unquote, rented out by the program office, and the program office will recoup some return on investment from that income. So let's talk a little bit about some of the ground rules and assumptions, and then we will revisit this chart in a later slide. So what does our human look like? So I think we mentioned in one of our earlier slides, when we first started attacking this problem here, we started trying to generate what our human look like. Is it a male or female? Where do they live? What kind of housing do they have? All of this information. And we quickly found out that researching all of the specifics for somebody would be a monumental task and take us down some rabbit holes. So when we found this BLS data and started analyzing it, we actually realized that now our human is going to look like the distribution of the expenditure survey responses. So instead of saying, well, is our human male or female, the reference person in our expenditure survey responses is 47% male, 53% female. So it's almost an average of expenditures for either sex. Same thing for race, education, and housing. One of the education distribution there, 69% were college attendees. We did assume our human obtained a bachelor degree, so we have costs for that, and got a job earning average median income. So that's another thing to talk about. Starting pay is not going to be average median income currently. We know this. Same thing when you retire at the end of your career, you will not be making average median income. You should be making more. So taking that average median income, we were pretty confident that over the course of your production phase, that average will be overestimating in the beginning and underestimating in the end, and should come out as a wash. We are assuming the our human pays US average tax amount. We did remove tax from the income since it is going back to the government. Again, that goes to the company. Human is rented out to a company. So there are some exclusions that we made just to kind of limit ourselves. These are very interesting exclusions that we would love to have had more time to investigate. Things like investment gains and losses. The market is very unpredictable. If we could estimate it, we'd probably all be millionaires. So we didn't want to try and incorporate that into this estimate. Charitable donations, retirement, all of those vary from person to person. Natural resource consumption. Does this person drive a Hummer or walk everywhere? Makes a very big difference. So this is a snapshot of our WBS, just showing a little bit more detail about the elements that we used. You will see that housing does contain things like shelter, utilities, household operations, and supplies. Additional content for this slide deck, we can see kind of a little bit more of that detail. If people have questions about what that contains, but I will say one caveat on the housing. Since this is survey data, if I am responding to the survey and I own my house, I'm going to put how much I pay in mortgage in one box and that my rent costs are 0. Similarly, if I rent, when I get to this part of the survey, it's going to ask me how much I pay in mortgage. I'm going to put 0. And for rent, I'm going to put how much I put in rent. So because of this, again, we aren't saying whether or not this person owns a house or rents a house. These are the average costs averaged between both people who rent and don't rent. So we're pretty confident that these are a good representation without making too many assumptions one way or the other that could influence other costs. You'll see transportation is similar. Vehicle purchases, not everyone makes a purchase, spends on gas, maintenance, insurance, so on and so forth. We do have an engineering change order line in here. Miscellaneous costs are captured by BLS expenditure data, so we toss those in there. And then you can see the state, federal, environmental costs that go throughout the life cycle. And again, this table is in $K per FY.
All right, so now we'll go through our sensitivity analysis. So the first chart that I want to walk through with you all is our tornado chart. So this chart shows which of our cost drivers are most sensitive to change, with the 80% probability level shown in orange and the 20% probability level shown in navy. We promised that we would call out if there were any changes. The one change that was made on this slide is that our tornado chart did not have the labels before for what color was what. So we did add that in here for you guys. So as you can see, the element that is most sensitive to change is our gross income, as this is something that can vary greatly from individual to individual based on career path chosen, even if they have the same education level. So that's exactly what Shannon was talking about earlier. So I actually can give personal testimony to this. So my sister and I both got bachelor's degrees from the University of Georgia. And I ended up going the STEM route, but she's now a librarian. So as you can imagine, we make vastly different salaries. And yes, that does get brought up at every family dinner we ever have. It's also important to note that our 80% probability level for gross income is lower than our 20% probability level. And this is because we're accounting for gross income as a negative cost to the human program, as it's funds that will be provided back to the program, right? Like we've said a couple times, to cover some of the overall life expenses incurred. So the next most sensitive cost drivers are federal government costs and the overall as the overall federal spending changes significantly from year to year. And housing costs are the next one, as that is something that can vary greatly from state to state, and whether a person rents or owns. Like Patrick said, we're not assuming one or the other. This is the average of those. So the second chart here is showing our cost contributors at our point estimate, our mean, and our 80% probability level. The largest costs for our human by far are government spending, with federal government spending being the top expenditure and state government spending being the second largest expense. And so this is primarily because these include the largest scope out of any of our WBS elements, as what it's doing is it includes all of our federal and state spending, and it's just normalized per capita. So we're taking that entire federal budget to include Social Security, national defense, a lot of other things, and dividing that by the US population. And same thing with state government, that includes quite a few things in there, transportation, Medicaid, any other miscellaneous state expenses, all are kind of wrapped in that line, whereas our other WBS elements are broken out at a much lower level. Government costs are then followed by housing costs, with the production phase housing and EMD phase housing being the next two largest expenditures.
All righty, so we have found some data, we have normalized it, we've generated some ground rules and assumptions, we've looked at our phased approach and said it's starting to make some sense, we agree with what we're looking at. How do we justify, how do we know we're anywhere near anything else? Well, lucky for us, we found a co-benefits risk assessment value of a statistical life. So this is a value that the EPA uses in cost-benefit analysis to represent how much people are willing to pay for small reductions in their risks of dying from harmful health conditions. So kind of an interesting statistic. So it's the benefits of avoiding premature mortality. So the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation has actually created a value of a statistical life workbook with a bunch of tabs to update this range. So I used this workbook and updated it with the latest inflation adjustments and historical change in real income. And we obtained a value of a statistical life from 6.1 million to 19.9 million in base year 2023. In order to compare this to our estimate, we came up with, instead of a whole life cost, a whole life value. This is the value if you, instead of take your income to be negative, now we make it a positive. This is your contribution to GDP. This value in our case was $7.72 million in base year 2023. And as you can see in the chart and table, our point is yellow and it fits comfortably in between the low VSL estimate and the central VSL estimate provided by the workbook. We did add a fifth point, even though it's not apples to apples, it is our then year escalated very, very roughly value. It just kind of caps the other end of this chart, even though we know the escalation is probably too high. This gave us some confidence in our 7.72 million, in our methodologies, and in the elements that we chose, knowing that we couldn't get as granular and in depth as this COBRA EPA value could, but this gave us a lot of confidence in our approach.
Alrighty, so back to the original question. What is the whole life cost for a human? Well, according to our analysis, it's about $1.92 million. And then kind of a breakout of what that looks like on our phased basis. The largest costs are incurred during the EMD phase, where it ranges from about $86,000 to $52,000 per year, and that makes sense with kind of that level of care that's required. This is then offset by a pretty good amount, about $500,000 during the production phase, during which time the human is able to return that investment made by producing goods and services through their career or their work, renting out their productivity to cover those expenses of living. And then we see an additional steady state cost of about $775,000 during the sustainment phase, as our human reaps the rewards of years of hard work in an expensive yet well-deserved retirement. So this is kind of our summary here of the estimate. And kind of just to, again, recap how we can be confident in our estimate, we already discussed our thorough process for selecting and evaluating our data sources, and then as well as our use of cross checks with the COBRA comparison to our whole life value.
When we first started this project, we had many great ideas for how to create a great whole life cost model, such as toggles, which prepare distinct estimates for any parameters that we could imagine for a human, like location, gender, and age. But we quickly noticed that in the 4 weeks we had to prepare this estimate, that intricate model couldn't be created. This left us with lots of decisions to make about which elements were essential and how to represent their cost. To navigate this complexity, after we established our initial WBS, we focused on identifying refinements to our model, which would produce the largest improvements in our confidence of the model. And this strategy saved us a lot of time and made the problem a lot more reasonable to progress through.
So yeah, as you can hear, there's a lot of evolving strategies, a lot of different opinions on this team, a lot of really great ideas. And so I think one of the biggest lessons we took away from this was just how important teamwork is. With a short time window to produce everything, we really needed to be focused. I know I stopped playing video games for a month. This is what I did in all my free time. So I had a unique opportunity to take on a small leadership role and just seeing what that involves, leading a team, building a collaborative workspace. We were all working full-time jobs while doing this, so just juggling responsibilities. So I think we all learned something very unique and important. These are just a couple of the many lessons that we all learned. And this has undeniably helped us develop additional skills and expertise to excel in this field. So very appreciative for this. So with that is the end of the main content. We were technically only given 30 minutes to present this information with about 15 minutes for questions and answers. So we decided to add some additional content to add a little bit of time and to really just show our appreciation to the judges and ICEAA and show how much we learned from this. So one of the first questions we got was, do you have an S-curve and what's your CV? So some of our material was not in our original PowerPoint main information. We did provide a backup Excel post file as well as additional slides that we didn't get to in our main 30 minutes. So this is a picture of our S-curve. As you can see, our CV is rather high, which we think is justifiable due to the uncertain nature of all of these cost elements. You can also see there's an interesting happening on our S-curve where it actually crosses the y-axis there and goes negative, and that's kind of to imply that if your human makes enough money, there's a chance that this total cost could be a negative. You could make your money back. Next question we got was that 2 of the 3 years utilized as the basis of the state and federal government costs are during COVID. Could we possibly be overestimating government costs due to the selection of these data points?
And our answer was that the government spending has steadily increased since 2018 and continues to rise as of 2023. While a model which utilizes data points reaching back further than 2019 may provide a reasonable alternative to what we established, we had no confidence that government spending would fall to the levels that it was previously at due to the period of high inflation that we're currently going through. And we settled on the methodology of using the average of 2019 to 2021. Notably, 2019 was pre-COVID, so it is at least a single data point which had no COVID influence.
Next question was whether or not we considered net present value in our estimate. And as with a lot of the other things, we really wanted to use OMB Circular A94, applied discount rates nominally or the real rates. But because we chose to stay in base year 2020-23 to avoid any inflation assumptions, we applied the same logic to net present value and just presented in base year. Next question we got was how exactly was ChatGPT utilized in the process of estimating the whole life cost?
Our response was ChatGPT was utilized similarly to how an engineer would be utilized in the cost estimation process. Upfront, we utilized ChatGPT to establish a reasonable scope to represent within the WBS for the whole life costs. And as we worked to establish data sources for the elements of the WBS, ChatGPT was utilized to identify potential data sources and to provide feedback on the reasonability of the estimation methodology.
So this is an example of the ChatGPT script. Our prompt was, our team's developing a whole life cost estimate. What are the critical components? And so as you can see, the response did give us a pretty solid list: education, housing, food, healthcare. However, it didn't really give us more than that. It didn't give us additional costs. It didn't give us where to find those costs. So a lot of back and forth was needed, and the responses were built upon. And so it was used as just a first stab, getting the lay of the land. And then obviously we had to add a lot of information to build out our full cost estimate. So we considered marriage costs. Did we include divorce costs? So on our team, 3 of our 4 members are happily married. And since we aren't planning for divorce costs, we assumed our human was not either. So our human got married to their soulmate, lived happily ever after. What would we have done differently if we were to do it again? So I think a couple of us have mentioned it, but we had limited time constraints. As you can see, we did have a collaborative calendar on the right. We did try to have quick scrums every Monday. We did try and plan out the week. We were able to keep it open, but unfortunately, certain things like creating those toggles, switches, comparison functions in ACE kind of got overcome by events. And then, like we had mentioned, estimating those excluded with justification costs would be a lot of fun, but take a lot more time than what we had. And the last question I have here is, what did we take into consideration outside of the BLS Consumer Expenditure Report? So the next slide contains a snapshot of the raw BLS data collected, so we can review that. So we utilized many of the cost lines from this data in different ways, applying either a full 2.5 consumers unit worth of costs or 1 consumer unit worth of costs, and also added lines not captured, like wedding, state, and federal taxes and environmental costs. And that can be seen more clearly on our methodologies table, which will be after the BLS data. So this is a snapshot of the BLS Expenditure Raw Data. So on the left most block, you can see the number of consumer units in thousands, how many people respond to this survey, some consumer unit characteristics, including their income, age, and the number of people in a consumer unit. So this is where we get there's 2.5 people in a consumer unit, 0.6 of a person under 18, 0.4 of a person over 65. And you can also see the percent distribution of survey respondents, their sex, housing tenure, race, education. The right 2 tables contain specific cost data. So the middle has some information about food at home and food away from home, alcoholic beverages, and then a whole list of what is covered in shelter, and housing, which includes shelter, utilities, fuels, and public services, household ops, household supplies, furnishings, so on and so forth. On the rightmost block there, you have apparel and services, transportation, healthcare costs, and entertainment costs. So as you can tell, we used a lot of the roll-ups for all of these and then added to some of those higher level elements. So this is our methodology. Like I said, most of these are a 3-year average of consumer expenditure data normalized by consumer unit. However, there are some that we added that were not consumer expenditure data. And you can see that as state, federal government, like we mentioned. So I think that was all the added material we have. Open it up to Megan to get us some questions if there are any.
Wrong button, sorry. Yeah, guys, everybody, if you have any questions for the team, go ahead and put them in the chat. I'm actually going to ask a question of my own, and I think you may have touched on this a little bit in the justified data points that you left out, but what was your favorite or sort of most wacky data point that you thought of that just seemed out of nowhere that you really wished you could have explored, but then just no, we can't do that?
So I got one. So there early on, we were thinking. I mean, obviously, some of these excluded costs. I guess I can go to there. Were some of the ones that were going to be loftier, and I think one of the ones that didn't even make it on the list would have been human waste removal.
Nice.
Right, because that's going to be incredibly hard to difficult based on your food intake and based on technology surrounding that, whether you have a septic tank. I mean, there's going to be a lot of considerations that we decided not to touch.
That's awesome. That's exactly that's exactly the sort of thing that was the real challenge here, is narrowing it down, figuring out what separating the wheat from chaff. And I'm sure there were some directions that all of the teams wanted to go in or could have gone in that we can't even imagine. So what a fun creative activity.
Yeah, Jennifer, you had a good idea at the very beginning of this effort.
Okay, so when we were talking about estimating the whole life or the whole cost of a human before it got specified to like whole life cost, I was just looking at, okay, the cost of a human. So it's like, okay, are we going to take the biological route with this? Like if we were to dissect a person and sell everything on the black market, what would we get for this person?
Just another avenue we did not go down.
We're having a sale on veal.
Yeah.
Well,
one of the things that made it, I thought that was just like the way we phrased it is the disposal costs. I couldn't get over that of just like we all deal with disposal costs in our estimates normally, and then we're talking about humans. And I was like, yeah, I guess like a funeral counts.
It sure does, and it will have environmental impacts. Every graveyard is taking up land space and all sorts of stuff. Well, it seems our audience is shy today, so I guess we're going to have to not get a lot of questions, but I hope everybody really enjoyed this. I know our judges did, and we can tell from the sound and from what we've seen today, the team really did as well. Everyone who enjoyed today, do swing by next week where one of our other teams, the team from Augur, is going to be presenting, same time, same channel. I want to thank Patrick, Gunnar, Jennifer, Alex, Bill Lane at Quantech for also helping the whole team and getting everybody together for this. Congratulations, team, well earned. Great job on the win, and we're really excited to have you in the ICEAA community. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and be good to each other.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.